So Sharon, when we broke, we were talking about the essentially the birth of the Clean Water Act, and it came out of a what feels like an ongoing sort of awareness that the rivers and water bodies in this country were getting increasingly polluted by corporations who were just dumping, using them as their own private dumps for all sorts of chemicals, paints, whatever I guess they wanted to, whatever was a byproduct of whatever they were making. And it culminated in the burning of the Cuyahoga River, which had caught on fire almost a dozen times before, and other rivers around the country also catching on fire. But something about the Cuyahoga made it just too much to ignore. And so the federal government passes the Clean Water Act. What did that Clean Water Act set out to do? What were the provisions of it?
Well, so it limited, the goal was to broadly to clean water, to clean up our water, to limit the kinds of pollution that could go into it. And broadly, they had set a goal of eliminating basically dumping into the water by 1985. That was to be all pollution discharges. Well, I don't have to tell you that that didn't happen. But broadly, they were hoping to make all of our waterways fishable and swimmable. And so we haven't done that.
Well, let me ask you about that goal. Okay, so it's one thing to stop everybody from polluting. It's another to clean up the pollution, right? Because this stuff doesn't just wash away into the ocean. It gets into the ecosystem. Right. It gets into the soil under the water. I mean, where are we on that project? I mean, or before we start to turn it back?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a huge project and a separate project. I think people would say, I think the answer is that we are in a much better position and much of that pollution has been cleaned up. To go with the example of the Cuyahoga and continue with that, it is a vastly improved watershed, and you've seen many species return, and you've seen water quality improve. At the same time, we have fallen far short of the goals that the Clean Water Act set out in terms of really cleaning the water and stopping pollution discharges. And it's important to note that we have made huge amounts of progress, but we haven't solved our problems by any stretch. And already now, most of our waterways are polluted. They violate federal water quality standards set forth in the Clean Water Act. And it's sort of mind-boggling when you look at the numbers. So it's more than 1 million miles of rivers and streams are contaminated. 70% of ponds, lakes, and reservoirs, almost 80% of bays, and 98% of the Great Lakes shoreline. And these are of those waterways that have been assessed. Most of them are violating the Clean Water Act in one way or another already. Okay,
so we have this situation where I guess is that a question of just the nature of the endeavor, or a failure in policing?
I think it's a failure in policing, and also just a disregard for the law on the part of the polluters.
Okay, and all right. So with that said, better than it was years ago. Obviously, we don't regularly have rivers catching on fire because of the level of pollutants. No. So, all right. So the Obama administration in 2015 promulgates some new rules, but what is the Trump administration rolling back? My understanding is actually supersedes. It gets reported as if it's the Obama rules, but it supersedes a lot more of those rules, doesn't it?
Yes, I know, it's so very confusing, and the more you get into the weeds, or whatever the right metaphor is, the more confusing it gets. And we can talk a little bit more about how the EPA is, I think, purposefully confusing it further. But yes, so the 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule, that was the Obama rule, and basically did increase the reach of the Clean Water Act a little bit, somewhere the estimates are 3 to 5%. And basically what it did was clarify that intermittent and what they call ephemeral streams, which are streams that rely on rainwater, are subject to that federal law and are protected. That rule kind of came in response to a series of lawsuits that industry had brought that were attempting to, and in some ways succeeding, in rolling back the reach of the Clean Water Act. So there had been, for about a decade, a little more before that, these lawsuits where industry was saying, actually, you think it covers all these waterways, but not this and not that, not this. And then, it was sort of this patchwork thing. EPA came in and said, okay, here's our rule, and we're going to say that these streams are covered. And I should note that when that happened in 2015, a number of environmental groups felt that it did not go far enough. They felt that, it was a compromise, it should have done more. In any case, industry hated it, flipped out, and continued, to aggressively demand that it be reversed basically since then. So Trump talked about it a lot on the campaign trail, and you hear a lot of big ag groups and big industry groups talking about it, that 2015 rule, as overreach. But basically the new rule, which came out on Tuesday, says it's pretty confusing, but what they do say is that ephemeral streams are definitely not covered. And then a whole bunch of water bodies that are not directly, if they're not directly connected by a physical waterway to what they call a navigable waterway, which is like a river or something that you can,
take a boat on. I mean, that's pretty big,
exactly.
Right? I mean,
right,
you can put a lot of chemicals. You can put a lot of chemicals into a stream or a river that is not navigable. In fact, as people drive around.
The administration says these navigable waterways and their tributaries are going to be protected by the rule, but if you're not directly connected to them by a waterway, like if you're just nearby, or if there's a waterway that only runs part of the year, and it may not, and is not directly connected to them, then it won't be covered by the law. And so one really interesting piece of this is, you hear these terms, it's like, well, what does that mean? And so, of course, that's what all we reporters have been trying to figure out. Exactly how much of the nation's water are we talking about? Well, when you ask EPA about this, and I should say before the rule came out, the estimates were about that around 60% of the waterways will lose protections, and that in the dry parts of the West, like Arizona, you might see as much as 90%. Wow. Well, when they released the rule, EPA pushed back on this. They said, no one can give these estimates because we just don't know, and it's not knowable. And anytime someone says they know, they don't know. E&E News actually got a PowerPoint through FOIA from the EPA, which shows that, in fact, they did these measurements themselves. Not only was it not knowable, they knew. And what it said was that 18% of our waterways of streams in the country are ephemeral, 52% are intermittent, and then what they say is many of the ephemeral streams are actually classified as intermittent. So
if I hear you correctly, I mean, we've got about 15, 20 seconds left. If I hear you correctly, we're talking about half of what constitutes, bodies of water, at least moving bodies of water, that are now subject to being dumping grounds for all sorts of chemicals.
Well, when you add in wetlands, yes. I
Wow.
think we're talking about more than half of the nation's wetlands, which are so important environmentally in terms of filtering contaminants out of water and providing storm surge, which is increasingly important in this time of climate change. And I think the impact, yes, is going to be huge.
It's going to be devastating. Sharon Lerner, thank you so much for the deep dive into this. I think this we're going to hear more about this as it becomes clear how the EPA is allowing corporations to poison our water and us. Thank you, Sharon Lerner.